Next on Brute Force, the history of weapons at war. They pack more destructive power than all the bombs of World War II combined. They're missile submarines. Propelled by the atom, these capital ships contain more technology per square inch than any other weapon system devised by man. Lurking beneath the waves for months at a time, always ready, they're missile submarines. Next on Brute Force, the history of weapons at war.
Completely self-contained and free of the need to surface, fleet ballistic missile submarines remain hidden by an oceanic curtain.
Dive! Dive! Dive!
Their locations unknown to any potential enemy, their all-volunteer crew is the most highly trained in the Navy. Trident missiles stand ready to launch within minutes of receiving the command, a responsibility held solely by the President.
Because of their unconventional role, because of their ability to stay submerged and be undetected, submarines are perhaps the most effective peacetime naval operational system. They project power by being unseen. They can always make port visits, they can always be seen, but most of the time they remain submerged, a hidden menace.
In March of 1990, the USS Tennessee, the lead Trident II fleet ballistic missile submarine, quietly sailed out of the Cumberland Sound at Kings Bay, Georgia, and headed out for the first operational Trident II patrol. This began the latest chapter in the dramatic 35-year history of the Fleet Ballistic Missile Strategic Weapons System. The 24 Trident II missiles carried on board the submarine incorporate major advances in missile design. Each carries 8 independently targetable nuclear warheads capable of engaging targets over 4,000 miles away, assuring a potential enemy that should he launch an attack on the United States, he would receive a devastating nuclear response.
You have the stealth of the submarine, the range of the Trident missile, the navigation equipment, all of these factors today make the Trident the most effective and certainly the most survivable strategic weapon yet developed.
By June 1991, 3 Trident II submarines were operational: the USS Tennessee, the USS Pennsylvania, and the USS West Virginia. A force totaling 10 Trident II submarines are planned for Atlantic deployment by the end of the century. As they head out to sea, the men aboard carry with them a submarine heritage that began more than a century ago. The idea of an undersea boat has intrigued man for centuries. As early as the 3rd century BC, legends tell of Alexander the Great lowering himself to the ocean bottom in a glass bottle. Many strange and unique inventions were devised to allow man to bring his earthly atmosphere with him. As he found ways to breathe underwater, he searched for new methods to propel himself through this new, mysterious environment. During the American Revolution, David Bushnell created his one-man submersible, the Turtle. As early operating problems were solved, man began to realize the potential of the submarine as a weapon. In the 1890s, a major breakthrough was made in submarine design with the Holland submarine, named for its creator, John P. Holland. His inventive genius would provide the basic principles of submarine design and propulsion, which would last into the age of the atom. In the years to follow, larger, faster submarines were developed, introducing new innovations like the periscope, deck guns, and diesel power plants.
It was a sort of a renegade element of naval officers that were interested in developing unconventional warfare. At that time, most ships were heavily armored, big gun surface ships, battleships, the dreadnoughts, lighter submarine chasers and destroyers. They all had a surface role. It was the submarine that was quiet and unconventional, and almost it was unfashionable. It was taken up almost as a sport, and eventually we would see a blossoming of submarine operations in the second decade of this century, and of course that really led into the First World War.
During World War I, Germany surprised the world with its fleet of Unterseebooten, or U-boats, and unleashed the destructive capabilities of the submarine. The U-boat, with its crew of 35 and its 2 diesel engines, had a top speed of 18 knots on the surface and could cruise submerged at 8 knots on battery power. With its policy of unrestricted submarine warfare, German U-boats sank more than 10 million tons of Allied shipping.
For all 4 years of World War I, there is a battle in the Atlantic of U-boats versus first British and then British and American anti-submarine forces. On several occasions, especially the spring of 1917, when the United States enters the war, the U-boats almost defeat Britain. In the spring of 1917, Britain is reduced to maybe 5 or 6 days of food for the country to survive.
With the Allies' new anti-submarine warfare tactics, like the depth charge and escort planes, the German U-boat threat was devastating. By the end of the war, 178 German submarines were sent to the ocean floor. Over the next 28 years, the United States, recognizing the value of the submarine, developed a number of different classifications of submarines. In the 20s, the R boats and S boats were introduced, followed by the enormous B boats with their twin 6-inch guns mounted topside. New innovations in torpedoes and the development of sonar allowed the United States to create its Gato-class submarine for large-scale production. With the outbreak of World War II, Germany would once again demonstrate the attacking power of the submarine. Its new secretly developed U-boat destroyed 681 Allied ships by July 1942. But the U-boat was not the only powerful weapon unleashed by Germany during World War II. At a secret laboratory in Peenemünde on the German coast, Ernst Steinhoff and his team of scientists developed what would become known as the V-1 and V-2 rockets. The V-1 was virtually a bomb with wings, a small pilotless aircraft powered by a pulse jet engine with no real guidance system. The V-1 carried over 1,800 pounds of explosives. It would fly a preset course, and when its fuel ran out, it simply fell to the ground, exploding on whatever lay below. Over 7,500 V-1 rockets were launched against Britain. 3,700 were destroyed by fighter planes and anti-aircraft guns. Those that did penetrate the defenses killed more than 6,000 people. The V-2 rocket was the most advanced rocket developed during the war, carrying a 2,000-pound warhead. The 46-foot tall V-2 weighed over 12 tons. but could reach an altitude of 6,500 feet powered by its liquid propellant rockets. The V-2 offensive came during the last 7 months of World War II, but was on too small a scale to influence the outcome of the war. More than 1,000 V-2 rockets were launched against Britain, killing almost 3,000 people. It was the V-2's development that would foreshadow today's ICBM and submarine-based missile programs. Allied bombing of Germany saw the destruction of the V-1 and V-2 rocket facilities and the eventual capture of missiles and supporting scientific documentation. But the fierceness of the V-2 rocket and the tenacity of the German U-boat wolf packs would soon be forgotten, with the demonstration of a power that would change the course of submarine design forever.
Missile submarines will continue in a moment here on A&E.
In 1945, the world witnessed the tremendous powers of the atom. Since nuclear fission is non-combustible and needs no oxygen to release energy, its potential as an underwater power plant was irresistible.
After World War II, the United States had the only major navy in existence. Submarines were without a mission. So we had a situation where we had a large, highly capable, well-trained submarine force and no enemy to go after with it. In that period, we see a lot of innovation in U.S. submarine ideas. The U.S. Navy started a very small program in Washington at the Naval Research Lab into the concept of nuclear propulsion. The senior member of this group was a captain named Hyman G. Rickover. Rickover has a reputation of being an iconoclast, someone who doesn't care for rules or regulations, someone who gets things done. Within the next few months, Admiral Rickover captures the Navy nuclear propulsion program, pushes it at a much faster rate than most people thought it could be done. And by 1954, we had built the world's first nuclear submarine, the Nautilus.
From January 1954, when the Nautilus was first sent down the waves on nuclear power, she would set numerous speed and submerged endurance records. The Nautilus traveled more than 62,000 nautical miles on her first core of uranium, cruising primarily submerged. A conventional diesel-powered sub would have consumed more than 2 million gallons of fuel to accomplish the same mission.
The advent of nuclear power made the submarine a true submarine. It enabled it to submerge and operate completely underwater, independent of air, for as long as the crew had duration. We're talking about submarines capable of going around the world several times without needing to be refueled.
Suddenly, instead of a submarine doing 10 knots for an hour underwater, it can do 10 knots for a year underwater. It can do 20 knots for a year or 30 knots for a year. With a diesel-electric submarine, doing 25 knots will deplete your battery in a few minutes.
The Nautilus was the world's first nuclear-powered submarine and the forerunner of this new generation of capital ships, which would totally revolutionize naval warfare, being able to arrive at a destination undetected by being totally submerged from leaving port until it arrived.
The most notable achievement of the Nautilus came on August 3rd, 1958, when she became the first ship to navigate the North Pole. Crossing from the Pacific Ocean to the Arctic Sea, she demonstrated the strategic importance of nuclear power.
In my opinion, the Nautilus is not simply another new submarine that can travel for practically unlimited distances under the water. I consider that she's a new weapon, and that she may have just as profound an effect on naval tactics and strategy as the airplane has had on war.
And Admiral Rickover and his staff insisted on certain capabilities. They insisted on quality control. They insisted on the very finest type of engineering work. They insisted on extremely competent training. They did all kinds of things to make sure that the program was going to work and work well. And they demonstrated with complete confidence that we could take those ships to sea and operate them with perfection, and we have done that ever since. The situation we have today is all due to the fundamental training and competence and capabilities that Admiral Rickover and his team put into that nuclear power program in the earliest days.
In the early 1950s, as Russia began to develop a prodigious submarine fleet, the United States Navy enacted Project Lamplighter to examine the value of a submarine fleet capable of launching missiles while submerged. It was concluded that defense of this weapon would be so difficult that it would be well advised to develop such a system.
The strategic weapons developed in the Second World War were basically airdropped nuclear bombs. The problem with an aircraft is you can never guarantee it will get through to its target, and you really don't have the undetectability that you require for an independent nuclear deterrent. The submarine is the ideal vehicle for an independent nuclear deterrent. Once you've developed a rocket that can carry a nuclear warhead and launch it from underwater, you can place it in a submarine, and you can more or less hide that submarine anywhere in what is effectively 4/5 of the world's surface.
When the Navy first conceived of putting ballistic missiles in a fleet of underwater launching pads, the thought was to use the Army's Jupiter missile and mate it with the atomic submarine. The Jupiter, an American modification of the German V-2 rocket, stood 60 feet tall and was filled with 100,000 pounds of highly volatile liquid oxygen and kerosene. The weapon required a countdown period as long as 10 hours. Naval scientists quickly determined that the inherent danger of large quantities of liquid fuel aboard a submarine made the Jupiter unfeasible. The Navy then developed the Regulus. This system required the submarine to surface, disengage a cumbersome launching pad, and then fire the air-breathing jet-powered short-range missile. The air-breathing missile, with its obvious limitations, was only a stopgap. The need for longer range, pinpoint accuracy, and greater payload eventually gave way to the ballistic missile and the development of the Polaris system in 1955. With the reduction in size of the nuclear warhead and the advent of solid fuel, the design of a much smaller missile was possible. Completion of the project would eventually involve more than 20,000 independent contractors and government agencies.
When Polaris was being developed, the submarine community, and indeed the Navy as a whole, did not want Polaris. Polaris was a strategic weapon, and the Navy felt, one, it would take away from the role of carrier aircraft, which had a nuclear strike capability. Two, just the cost of these large submarines would take away money from the rest of the Navy. So in general, the Navy was opposed to the Polaris submarine. Admiral Arleigh Burke was Chief of Naval Operations at the time. He made the decision, one, the Navy would have a submarine-launched ballistic missile program. Two, he appointed an aviator, not a submariner, but an aviator, Red Rayburn, William F. Rayburn, to direct the Polaris project. There's a classic memo that Admiral Burke, Chief of Naval Operations, wrote to Rayburn, the head of Polaris, which said he could have 50, I think the number was, of the top people in the Navy for his project. Red Rayburn had what was called a hunting license.
I gave Admiral Rayburn this letter because there was a lot of opposition within the Navy, too. Not opposition, there were a lot of differences of opinion. A lot of people thought this cannot be done. There's too much to do. There are too many things that are undeveloped, too many breakthroughs that we have to have. And so I gave Admiral Rayburn this letter and said, give this man what he wants, and he can choose anybody he wants, but he can't have very many. I also told him in the same letter that there are many cutoff points on this thing, many things that you have to go, that you have to be able to do. If you reach a stage where you cannot do the thing, we will kill the project.
Missile submarines will continue in a moment here on A&E.
Unlike the Jupiter rocket, which was an enormous flying fuel tank, the Polaris used a moldable plastic-like solid fuel, which when packed into the missile container and ignited became the engine itself. With this more stable fuel source, the Polaris had a range of 1,200 nautical miles. As experiments with solid fuel progressed, there were other problems to be dealt with. Swimming pool tests determined what effect water motion and depth would play on a missile that would have to live in seawater, fly through the Earth's atmosphere, and enter the vacuum of space. The missile would be launched from a submarine by means of compressed air, much the same way torpedoes are fired. Once proven in the laboratory, a series of ocean launching tests were devised. The pea shooter, pop-ups, sky caps, and one called the fishhook because of the way the missile was tethered. Long before the Navy would know whether the Polaris could really launch from beneath the sea, it had to take a calculated risk that the revolutionary missile would fire at all. The Navy concurrently designed and developed an atomic submarine to be the launching pad for the Polaris. In 1957, Rickover's Naval Reactor Group had under construction at the General Dynamics Electric Boat Works a 250-foot skipjack-class attack submarine called the Scorpion.
When the Polaris program started, here was a submarine ready to go. All you needed to put was missile tubes. So they literally split the hull and moved the tail end down the ways and kept the bow end at the top of the ways, and they dropped in a 120-foot section called the missile compartment and put 16 missile tubes in it.
This submarine measured 382 feet long and had a displacement of 6,700 tons. The Scorpion was renamed the George Washington and became the first fleet ballistic missile submarine. Like the Polaris, it was targeted for completion by 1963. When the Department of Defense authorized the development of the Polaris system, the Navy was to pay for it out of their existing funds. That meant they had to cut back on other programs to fund Polaris. But in November of 1957, Polaris was to receive its biggest boost from a Russian rocket, Sputnik. With the successful deployment of the Sputnik satellite, the United States accelerated her nuclear deterrent programs. The Polaris system received an additional $350 million. Admiral Rayburn revised his timetable and proclaimed he would have a Polaris submarine roaming the ocean by December 1960, 3 years ahead of the proposed schedule.
We were working at Cape Kennedy to test the missiles. And we were working down there at the same time. The space program was ongoing, and John Glenn and the rest of those people were down there. And we were just caught up in the tremendous excitement of bringing the technology along, as President Kennedy had said after Sputnik went over, you know, we're going to the moon. Well, we too were going to our own private moon in this Polaris Poseidon business.
Polaris went full speed ahead into production. Factories were built where there was once farmland. The launching system was contracted to Westinghouse near San Francisco. Rocket engines to Aerojet in Sacramento. Missile guidance systems to General Electric in Pittsville, Massachusetts. And the submarine guidance system to Sperry on Long Island. These companies, along with thousands of subcontractors, combined to form the largest cooperative in the history of weapons systems development.
We had all of these big corporations trying to bring systems together at one time. It was incredible to watch the enthusiasm and the attitude of everybody connected to that program, not just the crews. We're talking about industry.
By September 1958, the solid fuel concept seemed on its way. On pad 25A at Cape Canaveral sat a squat 28-foot champagne bottle, the Polaris missile in its first configuration. But when the button was pressed and the missile took off, it failed to program correctly. And the range safety officer exploded it at 40,000 feet in the sky. Post-mortem verdict, a malfunction caused by a faulty part. Admiral Rayburn read the contractor's A. Stern lecture. In October, they tried again, but the Polaris AX-2 exploded on its launch pad. The second stage, having been blown clear, remained intact but had to be destroyed. On the ground, the first stage belched fire like a Roman cannon. Post-mortem verdict: failure of an explosive bolt connecting stage 1 to stage 2. Critics began to call Polaris the snake killer, as the bushes around Cape Canaveral were infested with rattlesnakes.
Missile submarines will continue in a moment here on A&E.
At the Electric Boat Shipyard in New London, just a year and a half after the welding torch cut the Scorpion in half, the George Washington slid down the wave on June 9, 1959.
Christmas Eve, George Washington. Go!
She had taken 1 year less to build than any other submarine in her class. But along with submarine construction, there had to be some human engineering as well. Crews for the Polaris submarine would be required to remain at sea for months at a time. There, they would have to operate more complex equipment than on any submarine that came before. The Navy began training men for the George Washington at Sunnyvale more than 2 years before they ever saw a Polaris submarine.
South 45. Okay. Next stop will be 15. All right.
Up to this point, every Polaris fired had been from a stationary launching pad at Cape Canaveral. A ship launcher simulator was built underground at Cape Canaveral. In August 1959, the first attempt was launched on schedule and was a complete success. 8 more launches followed with no failures. Next, a ship named Observation Island was outfitted as a floating laboratory and launching pad. 6 Polaris missiles were fired from the Observation Island. At the same time, the George Washington was undergoing sea trials and ejecting dummy missiles out of its tubes. Before a live Polaris could be fired from a submarine, it had to be proven that a live hot Polaris could successfully be launched from below the surface and ignite above water. In April 1960, at San Clemente Island, off the coast of California, a launcher similar to that in the George Washington was towed out into the Pacific and submerged to a depth corresponding to a submarine launch position. Inside the launcher, a full-scale Polaris was loaded with a cut-grain charge to lift it 1,800 feet above the water. The control barges were cleared of personnel, and 30 minutes before firing, the first countdown on a live Polaris began.
Got a green board, here we go.
12, 11, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, fire.
All involved celebrated the first Polaris to be launched from beneath the sea and ignited while poised in midair. The technical achievement of this feat is dramatized by comparing it to a Jupiter liquid fuel launcher. The Jupiter was lined up on its solid platform for many hours with several corrections made for its plan of flight. In contrast, the Polaris leaves the water, sometimes at an unpredictable angle, makes gyroscopically controlled corrections, and takes off towards the atmosphere and its target. The ability of the missile to locate itself and head off to a predetermined target was explained by Admiral Rayburn.
The heart of the navigational system is a ship's inertial navigational device or system. It's called SINS, S-I-N-S. It properly set from a known place, which you do before you go to sea. It tells you where you are. It senses motions by means of some ingenious devices of transferring the knowledge from the SINS to the missile guidance system, the brain of the missile. It knows where the missile is going, and because we have preset into it where it should be going, it compares the inserted correct path with what the missile is actually doing, and it gives it the necessary commands to get back on the correct path.
The final test of Polaris was the launching from a submerged submarine. Admiral Rayburn had said that George Washington would fire Polaris by August of 1960. A target date was set for July 18th. 11 days prior to this test, the Polaris was to undergo a full-grain shot from the Observation Island simulator. The missile exited the launch tube as planned, ignited, and began its programmed flight, but then went south. With the critical launch date approaching, the incident aroused skepticism, but Admiral Rayburn would not be deterred. Admiral Rayburn decided to keep his date at sea. On that fateful day, the George Washington set sail with nearly 3 times its normal company capacity. Its full crew, Admiral Rayburn and a complement of technical experts. Nearby, the Observation Island, loaded with more experts and massive amounts of technical equipment, sailed a parallel course. 30 miles off Cape Canaveral, the George Washington throttled down her engines to a speed sufficient only to hold it against the current and assumed launch depth. At 1:30, the final countdown began.
Nickname Mobilize Lima. Confirm that you have no further need for command carrier. Over.
Mobilize Lima. Mobilize Lima. This is Nickname. Nickname.
Mobilize Lima. Roger. Out.
Weapons launcher, tube number 9 is pressurized.
Opening the muzzle hatch on tube 9.
Tube number 9, muzzle hatch locked open.
T-minus 20 seconds.
Stand by.
10 seconds.
8, 7, 6, 5,
seconds.
4, 1. Wait, 1.
Damn it! Hold!
No umbilical retract.
Bypass, no umbilical retract.
Wait, 1.
With 1 second remaining, the launch was aborted. A malfunction was discovered in the umbilical link between the submarine and the missile.
He counted down to 1 second and then stopped for daddy go, say, or something.
3 more attempts were ordered by Rayburn that afternoon, and 3 times the countdown was aborted in the final minute. Finally, at 7:45, a tired and discouraged crew heard from their captain.
Now hear this. The George Washington will not fire today. The George Washington will not fire today.
The George Washington and the Observation Island returned to port. The reporters on board were politely told not to report the failure pending another launch attempt. The event was never reported.
All ahead 1/3. Left full rudder.
2 days later, the George Washington and the Observation Island put to sea once again.
Minus 30 seconds.
Don't go, Admiral.
The men of the Polaris project had learned to live with failure, but they knew that another malfunction could be fatal to the entire program.
Minus 10 seconds.
Stand by. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
Fire. As always.
With a successful stage separation, the missile headed up to its cutoff altitude, the point at which the second stage had carried the warhead out of the Earth's atmosphere. It then kicked the warhead, which in wartime would carry a hydrogen bomb, into its proper trajectory.
Good work. There you are, Admiral. There you are.
Rayburn talking. I would like to most sincerely congratulate your fine skipper, Captain Osborne, and every member of this crew on what is, in my opinion, the most significant happening since the day that the airplane flew, and certainly the day that it flew off of a ship of the Navy. You may not realize this now, and the world may not realize it. But deep in our hearts, those of us that know the most about it, and that's certainly you, we have given to our country the preeminent weapon for her defense that has been brought down the road of inventions for over 2 decades. I compliment you. You're a wonderful gang, and I know you're going to serve your country in a splendid fashion. We're mighty proud of you.
2 hours later, to erase the memories of the earlier disappointments, Rayburn fired a second Polaris. This was another perfect shot. As it lifted towards its Caribbean target, the crew was reminded that in combat, 16 missiles would be fired within 15 minutes. All the missiles would be launched before the first one reached its target. As the George Washington turned back to Cape Canaveral, a sailor hoisted an old broom on the periscope, a Navy submarine tradition signifying a clean sweep.
Missile submarines will continue in a moment here on A&E.
Within 4 short years of the successful Polaris launch from the George Washington, a fleet of ballistic missile submarines were in service patrolling the seas. Each carried their twin rows of 8 missiles, which the crews fondly dubbed the Sherwood Forest. From 1959 to 1960, 5 George Washington-class submarines were built from converted skipjack subs. 1961 to 1963 saw the construction of the Ethan Allen class, the first complete ballistic missile submarine design. From 1963 through 1967, 31 Lafayette-class submarines were built, bringing the U.S. Navy's submarine fleet to 41. 41 for freedom, as they came to be known. Along with the development of the Polaris submarine fleet came its support network. Specially designed tender ships had to be built to help maintain the submarines. Ships like the Proteus, based in Holyloch, Scotland. During 30 years of support from the FBM program, the squadron at Holyloch conducted nearly 1,000 strategic deterrent patrols. Since the submarine could remain submerged far longer than practical for the men aboard, a system of rotating crews was developed. Known as blue and gold crews, they ensured the submarine's constant deployment.
The internal conditions on a Polaris submarine require quietness because the whole need for the boat is to be stealthy. These submarines have the capability of long endurance patrols, so they need to have good air, good ventilation, good lighting systems, and things for the crews to do. The crews, which number 120 to 180 depending on the type of missile-carrying boat, are in 3 watches. They also have to have recreation time. They have proper mess and dining facilities. Basically, you have everything that you would expect to find in a surface combat ship, but in a submarine.
Polaris was an instant success. Polaris submarines could not be found by the Soviets with the existing detection systems. Polaris went through 3 generations, the Polaris A1, A2, and A3, each one a more efficient warhead, a longer-range missile. Then came Poseidon. Poseidon was the first MIRV, or multiple independently targeted reentry vehicle, the first multiple warhead missile put aboard U.S. submarines, in which each missile warhead, and up to 14 could be carried, could be aimed at a separate target within a general area. This meant that one submarine could now carry 16 missiles, each with 14 warheads, destroy a whole array of Soviet targets in a given area.
The Poseidon missile had an increased range of 2,500 nautical miles and fit neatly into existing submarine missile tubes, a tribute to forward-looking system design.
Poseidon, in turn, was followed by the Trident I missile, which gave us more range and more accuracy. And today we have at sea the Trident II missile, which is a MIRV warhead, multiple reentry vehicles, and has the accuracy as if it were launched from a land position where you know exactly where you are, obviously.
With the advent of the Trident missile, the Ohio-class submarine was developed. Measuring 560 feet long and 42 feet wide, it is the largest submarine in the U.S. fleet, with a displacement of over 18,000 tons submerged. Carrying 24 long-range Trident missiles, she is a most formidable nuclear deterrent, hidden, mobile, and always ready.
Probably the three best characteristics that we have are stealth, agility, and endurance. It's a real thrill for me to take the ship to sea and put it through its paces, make it do what it's supposed to do, and then think about, you know, this is 18,000 tons here that is this responsive, this controllable, and this docile, if you will, in the hands of a well-trained crew.
The training of its submarine crews has always been of primary importance to the Navy. Facilities at the Naval Sub Base in Groton, Connecticut offer the most comprehensive advanced training available.
Helm on head 2/3. All head 2/3, helm on. Brake control for red.
Here, every undersea emergency can be recreated. From the command and control simulators to the dive simulator, which realistically creates the responsiveness of the submarine, trainees learn to cope with their new undersea environment.
Engine mode, all control. The ship has suffered a collision port side out. The sector states the additional damage and make reports to control.
The epitome of team training takes place at Damage Control Trainer, or Get Wet Tank. As students respond to instructors and try to stop the ship from flooding, the term team training brings on new meaning. As the submarine heads out to sea, its destination known only by a select few, its unseen vigil beneath the sea goes unheralded except by loved ones.
No matter how long you've been doing this, it's as tough as it is the first day that you left for the first time and you heard that diving alarm go off and you realize that you were going to be separated, but essentially the world, for 90 to 100 days, sometimes not more. When we go out to sea, the only thing that we have as contact on the outside world are newsgrams, you know, basic news broadcasts, and also the thing they call family grams. Out of a 3-month deployment, you were allowed to get 8 of them, and each one of those were only 40 words apiece. It is absolutely amazing what those 40 words will do for a person. All you want to hear is, the family is okay, I'm all right. So we get that message, and there's no way to respond, no way to say, pick up the phone and say, I love you, I really miss you. So you're really out of touch. There's no sunshine, no radio. It's really hard to tell. The only way you can tell if it's morning, if there's eggs, you know, you're serving it on the menu. People say, well, gee, that's a lot of hardships. You know, I'm sitting here saying, oh, it's so tough, it's hard. But with that is the pride that comes along of knowing the job that you're doing. If I wasn't enjoying what I was doing, I wouldn't be here.
This quiet dedication to duty is the hallmark of the missile submariner and leads to fulfillment of their mission, an effective strategic deterrent for today and tomorrow.
The fact that Polaris, Poseidon, Trident carried out their missions, the fact that they never had to fire a missile in anger, is the proof of the pudding that the system worked to perfection. And there isn't any question that the success of that program, as far as a viable Allied nuclear deterrent capability is concerned, is one of the main features in bringing the Cold War to a successful close today.
The Soviet threat has receded and been replaced by a third world threat. There is now the risk of third world nations, of another Saddam Hussein. In a world where there is proliferation of ballistic missiles, it's invaluable to the Americans the British, the French and other allies to keep their submarine force in being. Submarines are perhaps the most effective peacetime military weapon system at sea.